This is the story of how I deprogrammed from an oppressive society through being a former opioid user and using Ibogaine treatment.
Psychedelics are said to shift our fixed perspectives, giving us a bird's eye view of our own lives and helping to remove the lenses of cultural, religious, and social conditioning through which we are taught to see the world. They are being used therapeutically and somatically to treat depression, addiction, PTSD, and trauma, and many are using them to explore the ineffable, those unknown realms of consciousness and beyond. Join us in Adventures of the Psyche as we learn how psychedelics have transformed people's lives. Hello, friends. Welcome to Adventures of the Psyche. Today we are joined by Juliana Mulligan, who shares how her experiences with opioids and Ibogaine allowed her to better understand oppressive societal structures and overcome the lifelong impacts from childhood bullying. Juliana Mulligan has been an active member of the Ibogaine community for nearly a decade, having worked in 3 Ibogaine clinics, completed Andrew Tatarsky's IHRP training, and has presented at multiple psychedelic and harm reduction conferences. She is currently working on her MSW at Hunter College, and under her current business in Vision Ibogaine, she works therapeutically with people, supporting them in preparation for and in integration after treatment.
I grew up in a conservative, wealthy Southwest Florida town with lots of Republicans and people playing golf and retired people. My parents are professional astrologers, and I grew up going to India because my family's followers of a spiritual master named Meher Baba. So as you can imagine, I did not quite fit in my Republican golf playing retirement community. I went to a school with the children of wealthy Republicans starting when I was 8 years old, and none of the kids wanted to be friends with me. I sat alone at lunch at 4 years. Children were actively bullying me and doing mean things like throwing away my homework and hiding my library books. And I did not really have any social connections outside of one friend I had at another school. Even once I got a little bit older in middle school, there were girls that let me sit with them, but they were still pretty nasty to me. And it was super traumatic. That's, a pretty crucial age to develop social skills, and I just didn't have that. Obviously, it influenced my teenage years as well, and I was trying a lot of drugs, and I dropped out of high school. I even managed to get into a good college, even with dropping out of high school, and I got kicked out of there for my drug use. So it was kind of a series of disasters, lots of adventure as well, but lots of really traumatic and difficult experiences. I also want to acknowledge the trauma of growing up in a capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal society that many of us experience and which really impacted me. Basically, from when we're small children, we're trained to focus on our mistakes and to perfect our mistakes. We're basically being trained to be little obsessive compulsive disorder perfectionists whose value lies only in the grades we get at school, only in the college that we get into, and the career that we're working towards. It's pretty awful and dehumanizing, and there are many parts of myself that were not able to be expressed within the educational system that I was a part of. So this was also super traumatizing. I was told that who I wasn't right, and I didn't fit into the system, and this was equally as traumatic as not having any friends. So when I was around 20 years old, I was introduced to my first large dose of an opioid. It happened to be methadone, and it was the first time that I felt like connected to life. All of my anxiety and depression was suddenly gone. I felt completely at peace. I felt excited to be alive, and of course, this meant that I wanted to keep doing it. So I was doing it once a week and then twice a week. And then, of course, at a certain point, I developed a physical dependency so that I had to keep doing it. This went on and off for the next 7 years, and I went through a series of near-death, destructive, disastrous experiences. I went to county jail for 3 months when I was 22 years old. I overdosed, went into a coma, and narrowly survived that. I got beaten up. I was homeless at different points. And I went through the traditional route of rehabs a couple of times, methadone, Suboxone, 12-step programs, none of which were helpful. The good thing about all of this is it was super influential and impactful for the work that I do now with drug users, and I'm really grateful for all of it. But at the time, obviously, it wasn't that fun. One of the experiences, though, that was really big for me was going to county jail when I was 22. When I went, I was on Suboxone, so I had 2 cold turkey off of Suboxone once I arrived in the jail. It was the early days of Suboxone, and so the doctor and medical team at the jail would not acknowledge that Suboxone had a withdrawal. They told me that it was all in my head, even though they saw me not sleep for 2 weeks, and they put me into a medical isolation cell that had a plexiglass front so that I could be observed. And for 2 weeks, I basically paced back and forth. I had nothing to read, nothing to write with, and I, obviously was going a little insane. At the end of the 2 weeks, I had kind of this spiritual epiphany where I was washing my socks in the sink of the jail cell, and suddenly I was flooded with this immense gratitude for being able to wash my socks, for the way that the water felt, for all of the things I was learning, for all of my experiences. And these words came to my mind that I was in jail doing social research. And I knew in that moment that I was going to make it my mission to just learn, observe, and make people laugh, because it's quite a miserable place in county jail. And that's what I did. And I totally transformed the experience. And going through that, it super informed my work. It was, very special to see a segment of the population that many people will never see or understand, and be a part of that dynamic with all of those wonderful women. So I'm actually really grateful, although I don't necessarily recommend doing it. It happens to play a major role in my story. Regardless of having that powerful experience, I kept using opioids over the next, I guess it went on for about 4.5 more years. I had a little break from them when I was about 26, and I moved to Bogota, Colombia to teach English. Eventually, Colombia is not a good place to move to when you're trying not to do drugs. So eventually, of course, I was doing cocaine, and I figured out how to get as many opioids as I wanted over the counter with no prescription. So I had basically unlimited fentanyl, Dilaudid, morphine, oxycodone, which you would think, wow, it's an opioid user's dream. Because in the US, street opioids are so expensive. Unless you're super rich, you can never quite get as many as you need. So I finally had as many drugs as I wanted, and guess what? It was not fulfilling, and I was super tired of it. And after a while, there was no euphoria. It was only staying away from getting sick, and I felt super isolated in a very dark place, kind of like living in a living hell all by yourself, and I wanted out of it. I had already tried all the conventional routes, and I'd heard about Ibogaine a few years before that from a friend. So something in me just knew this is the only thing left, and I'm sure that this is going to work, and I just know it, and I'm done with this. And I was going to order it online and do it myself. Thankfully, a friend talked me out of doing that, and I contacted my mom for help because I was broke. I didn't think that she was going to want to help again for like the millionth time. But surprisingly, she was 100% on board. So was my dad. And in a few days, I was on a plane to a clinic in Guatemala. Unfortunately, the clinic that I chose was super unsafe and not following the clinical safety protocols, which I learned later on when I started working in the community. And they gave me around double the amount of Ibogaine you should ever give a human being. And I ended up having cardiac side effects, which does happen with Ibogaine, which is why it has to be done safely. And I had 6 cardiac arrests and ended up in an ICU on an external pacemaker for 2 weeks in Guatemala. Despite this happening, I felt completely liberated waking up in the hospital. I kind of didn't care about the medical emergency aspect because I wasn't in withdrawal, which is unbelievable after going through countless cold turkey withdrawals as an opioid user. To suddenly get off of a super high dose of fentanyl and not be sick is quite the experience. I was in disbelief about that, and I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off of me. I had no guilt, shame, remorse, regret about everything that I had been through. I saw saw how it all had meaning and made sense, and that it was the training for the work that I was supposed to do. It was like this beautiful thing where everything fell into place, and it was like, okay, I saw how it all made sense and how it all had purpose, and now I was on this mission. Finally in my life, I felt like I had a sense of purpose for the first time. I get to harness what I've been through, and I get to use it to help drug users through working with Ibogaine, or working through any way possible to change the way drug users are understood, treated, and viewed in the society.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Juliana. I'm curious to hear more. How did having unlimited access to opioids play a role in you shifting your relationship to addiction?
So having unlimited access was a big deal because, as I was saying in my story, I always had super limited access in the US. So it was always this fantasy like, oh, if only I could have as much as I wanted, it would be amazing. And so when I finally had that, at first it was very exciting. And then I quickly realized that it was miserable, and actually being in that state was not what I wanted. There wasn't even euphoria left anymore. It was just hiding from getting sick all the time. So that helped me to realize, yeah, this isn't how I want to live. And that's the thing, is that life is a series of trial and error and experimentation to figure out what we do and don't like. And so when that process gets interrupted by somebody pushing an agenda onto us, or by the law pushing an agenda onto us, then people don't get to figure out what they do or don't like, or what does and doesn't work. So that's why I'm a huge proponent of letting drug users do the drugs they want, hopefully facilitating that in a safe way. Not throwing them in jail, for example, providing safe using products, and offering the support when they're ready to take it. Also, I just want to note that maybe for some people, not using opioids or stopping use of opioids isn't the right thing. Maybe people need to be on them for longer, for the rest of their lives, because it's a medication that works for them. It just so happened that it's not the right thing for me, and I'm really glad that I got to figure that out on my own.
And you mentioned this earlier, that you advise people on this path to connecting to their inner wisdom. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that looks like, and if you have any advice for people watching on how they can do this for themselves.
So the first part of that is basically just stopping listening to your family, stop listening to society, and stop people pleasing your family and loved ones, and society pleasing by doing what they want. Just because the mainstream narrative says that you need to stop doing drugs and that's the only right thing, doesn't mean that it's the case. It's definitely not the case. There's many people who only use certain drugs successfully and it works for them. There's people who just reduce the use of their drug of choice and that works for them, and that's totally fine. So just ask yourself, one, what is my drug use doing for me? Is it helping me in the way I want? And if it's not, what are some ways that I could be helped better? Maybe there's some other techniques, or maybe there's some other things I could do with the drug use that would help me more. And when I work with people and I ask these questions, it's often the first time that anybody is asking them what they want and what they think. And often people still give me the answers that society has told them. It takes a long time to deprogram from, oh, it should be like this and I need to do it this way. So that's kind of the first thing. I also really work with people a lot in deprogramming from traumatic 12-step narratives. I know the 12-step program works for some people, but for me and many of my clients, it was very traumatic to be told there's only one way to do things, and if it doesn't work for you, then something's wrong with you. So I often work with people and coming up with new ways to understand their drug use. One of those things is deprogramming from the concept of powerlessness. The thing with drug users is most of us have been disconnected from our own inner power, wisdom, and intuition from a very young age. And so the last thing that we need to do is to force them to say that they are powerless. People need to be empowered and reconnected to their power. And so I really work with people to reconnect to that by asking a lot of questions, totally trusting and supporting their answers, coming up with new solutions, but always together. It's never an agenda pushing thing. And the other thing is to start prioritizing joy. Start prioritizing the things that inspire you when you wake up, not that are productive. It doesn't ever have to be productive. It can just be things that you enjoy, and to focus on doing that and make that a priority, because the trauma from capitalism also tells us that our value is based in our production. And so if one great way to protest against that is just do things that feel good.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Juliana.
Thank you so much for having me.